In this subunit, we're going to discuss the one-year provision of the Statute of Frauds. Okay, let's refresh our memory about the types of contracts that are within the Statute of Frauds. We have marriage, year, land, executor, guarantee, sale. All right, that leaves us, based on what we've already talked about, we now need to talk about the one-year provision and the sale provision. We'll talk about the UCC a little bit later. Let's, in this subunit, focus on the one-year provision. All right, here is the one-year provision. Contracts not to be performed within 1 year are within the Statute of Frauds and must be in writing. Courts have construed this very narrowly. In other words, what courts are saying is that if it would be a breach to perform the contract in a year or less, then it is within the Statute of Frauds. In other words, only contracts where performance in less than a year or in a year or less is a breach of the contract is within the Statute of Frauds. So let's look at a couple examples to make this a little bit clearer. Here's the first example. Employer hires employee to work for a 2-year term. So we have an employment contract for a duration of 2 years. This contract is within the Statute of Frauds. In other words, it must be in writing. Why? Because there's no way you can perform a 2-year contract in less than a year, or I should say in a year or less. There is no way to perform a 2-year contract in a year or less. If the employee leaves after 6 months or after a year or after 364 days, or if the employer fires employee after 364 days, this would be a breach. Therefore, this contract is within the Statute of Frauds. Let's look at another example. Let's say that developer hires contractor to build a skyscraper, and this will take 5 years. There is no way practically that contractor can finish this skyscraper in less than a year or in a year or less, right? This contract is not within the Statute of Frauds. And you say, wait a minute, it's a 5-year contract. No, it's not really a 5-year contract. It's a contract for the building of a skyscraper, and therefore it is not within the Statute of Frauds. Well, here's a little test to see if you can see if the contract is within the Statute of Frauds. If contractor finished the building, finished the skyscraper in a year or less, would the contractor be in breach? No, the contractor wouldn't be in breach. Normally, under these types of contracts, contractors are encouraged to finish early. So this contract is not within the Statute of Frauds. Just because it might take longer than a year doesn't mean that it's a contract not to be performed within a year. Let's look at some common fact patterns to get a better idea of how the one-year provision works. Remember, courts are going to construe it narrowly. All right, so remember, the phrasing of the statute is a contract not to be performed within a year of its making is within the Statute of Frauds and is not enforceable unless it's in writing. So here's the first common fact pattern. A contract to work from January 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2017. The parties entered the contract on January 1st, 2017. So remember what we're looking for, a contract not to be performed within a year of its making. So when was this contract made? It was made on January 1st, 2017. When will the performance be finished? December 31st, 2017. So it's a full year. That is a year. That is, courts will say that this is not within the Statute of Frauds. In other words, an oral contract will be enforceable. 1 year exactly is not within the Statute of Frauds. A contract to work from January 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2017. The parties entered the contract on October 31st, 2016. All right, so remember the phrasing of the statute, not to be performed within a year of its making. When was this contract made? It was October 31st, 2016. When will the contract's performance be completed? December 31st, 2017. That is more than a year. So this one is within the statute of frauds. It's not to be performed within a year of its making, and its making is October 31st, 2016. Now, some people say, well, there's a potential that the employee in this contract of work will die within 1 year. So then if the employee, there's that potential, if the employee dies, then it will be completed within a year. Courts have been saying this. Early termination because of death is not performance, and the statute requires that it has to be performed within a year. If it can be performed within a year, it's not within the statute. And dying within a year of a 2-year contract, for example, is not performance of that contract. So that contract is still within the statute of frauds, even though there's a potential that one of the parties will die within the year. All right, let's look at some more common fact patterns. A 3-year employment contract that can be terminated by either party with 2 weeks' notice. Well, can you perform a 3-year employment contract within a year? No, you cannot. But what about that 2 weeks' notice? Well, courts have said that 2 weeks' notice, terminating with 2 weeks' notice, is early termination and is not performance. So even though you can terminate it within a year, you can't perform it within a year. You can't perform a 3-year employment contract in a year. So this contract is within the statute. It must be in writing. How about a contract to build a high-speed rail service from New York City to Washington, D.C.? The parties expect it to take 10 years to complete. Well, the question is not how long the parties expect it, but is it legally required to take more than a year? If it's legally required to take more than a year, then it's not to be performed within a year and it must be in writing. In this case, imagine the builder, the contractor, built it within a year. Even though that's not practically possible, it is legally possible for the contractor to build it in less than a year. In that case, the contract is not within the statute of frauds. So if there's a potential for a party to perform the contract, legally perform the contract within a year, then it is not within the statute of frauds, even if it is practically impossible to perform it in a year. So this contract is not within the statute. Early completion, in under a year would not be a breach of the contract. How about a contract for as long as Mary is alive? Well, courts have said that this is not within the statute. It is a contract for an uncertain duration, and contracts for uncertain durations are not within the statute of frauds. In other words, an oral contract would be enforceable.